Asserting queenside dominion, white immediately probes for control and potential imbalances. A fianchetto of the bishop on g7 is often a long-term defensive strategy, preparing for potential queenside expansion. Securing the center with knights and preparing for further pawn expansion into the middle is a sound positional idea. Unleashing the fianchettoed bishop, this establishes a potent long-range diagonal threat. Asserting central influence, this thrust prepares to build a pawn chain, aiming for long-term queenside pressure. Solidifying the center and opening the bishop's diagonal are the key ideas here. Opening the center creates immediate pawn tension and fight for central squares. Unleashing the knight toward the center opens dynamic possibilities and pressures white's advanced pawn structure. Solidifying the center with f3 might create some pawn weaknesses later, but it offers immediate kingside support. Castling ensures the monarch's safety amidst white's advancing pawn phalanx, solidifying a defensive structure. Fortifying the center's dominion, white builds a robust pawn chain, preparing for kingside pressure while keeping queenside options fluid. Preparing to expand on the queenside, a subtle move to unlock potential pawn advances. Orienting the queen for a central pawn push, while preparing kingside castling adds flexibility. Solidifying the pawn chain, this prepares to contest the center more actively, potentially fianchettoing the queen's bishop next. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal sharpens the central fight and prepares kingside castling for eventual king safety. Expanding on the queen side, black challenges white's central space and seeks active counterplay. Developing the knight to the king side reinforces the pawn chain and prepares for a potential queenside expansion, subtly shifting the battleground. Anchoring the knight here bolsters the queenside structure and prepares a potential e5 advance, aiming to contest the center. Castling here secures the king, preparing a rook to join the central struggle and potentially launch an attack on the queenside pawn storm brewing. Preparing a flank expansion, RB, aims to liberate the b-pawn for pawn breaks and potential pressure on the queenside. Disrupting black's queenside pawn structure offers white a temporary outpost on the now open c-file. Opening the a-file decisively, black repositions the pawn to contest the central influence and prepare for counterplay along the flank, a bold reaction to white's pawn sacrifice. Aggressively pushing the queenside pawn seeks to expand space and potentially create an outpost for white's knight. Asserting control over the central squares and preparing to challenge white's pawn chain with a knight maneuver. Opening the queenside flank aggressively, white aims to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially exploit open lines. Seizing initiative along the file, black opens critical lines for their rook, forcing white's hand. Striking at the pawn chain, white seeks to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially open lines for their knights. Reclaiming the central d-file with the knight offers much-needed counterplay. Seizing the open file, white initiates aggressive play, challenging black's central control and threatening to unravel the queenside. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the queenside potential. Instigating pressure on the queenside, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and prepare for an advanced assault. Pressing the queenside pawns suddenly unlocks a dynamic struggle along the a-file, challenging white's rook. Repositioning the rook to the b-file now contests control of this open highway, aiming to disrupt black's queenside ambitions and prepare for potential pawn advances. A bid for queenside counterplay, rerouting the knight and preparing to contest the open c-file for potential action. Repositions the knight to a more active central square, potentially eyeing the queenside pawn structure and preparing for further queenside expansion or a central thrust. Releasing pressure on the queenside and preparing for potential pawn pushes, this retreat eyes a more active central role for the queen. Unleashing the queen to eye the queenside pawn structure, seeking exploitable weaknesses after black's recent rook maneuver. Unlocking the c-file for future pressure against the white king's safety is a good idea. Reasserting queenside pressure, white repositions the monarch of the board, aiming to exploit the potentially exposed black king. Exploiting white's central immobility, black cracks open the d-file, inviting a tactical skirmish and disrupting white's pawn structure. Cracking open the center with this pawn thrust demands careful calculation as it opens lines towards the king side. The knight retreats, aiming to redeploy to a more active square on the king side or reinforce the central pawn push. Reclaiming central influence, this knight aims to reposition for pressure on black's queenside structure. Unlocking the c8 rook's potential and preparing to counterattack on the queenside signals a shift in black's intentions. Capturing the bishop unwinds the cramped position, opening lines for an aggressive kingside push. Cracks open the kingside, but sacrifices pawn structure for kingside exposure. Aggressively seizing the open file, this maneuver pressures black's queenside structure. Anchoring the rook on c7 fortifies the queenside pawn structure, preventing immediate weaknesses against white's aggressive queenside play. Consolidating the rook's influence on the open file, aiming to pressure the queenside. Reuniting the queen with the rook now eyes the c4 square, hinting at a potential rook lift to exploit the open c-file. Repositioning the rook to survey the queenside offers potential for a queenside expansion or a shift towards the center. Solidifying the center and preparing a pawn break, this move aims to disrupt white's attacking ambitions while potentially opening lines for counterplay. Repositioning the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to support a queenside expansion or a central pawn thrust. Opening the bishop's diagonal offers counterplay while challenging the cramped queenside. Seizing the open files with the pawn storm initiates a dynamic struggle, potentially overextending white's kingside. Shifting the monarch to a safer square, a prudent preparatory measure against the open diagonals. Repositioning to id7 and potentially penetrate the kingside. Liberating the knight opens crucial lines, potentially turning a passive defense into a dynamic counterattack. Opening the c-file creates immediate pressure on black's queenside pawn structure. Shifting the queen back to d8 aims to consolidate defensive structures, but relinquishes central pressure and leaves the kingside somewhat exposed to future advances. Asserting control over the central files is paramount now, preparing for potential pawn advances. Transitioning the queen from the dangerous central files aims to bolster the king's defenses and prepare for future pawn advancements. Positioning the rook on the open file aims to pressure black's queenside and potentially create attacking chances down the c-file, while simultaneously offering defensive support. Attempting to untangle the pawn structure offers little solace, as white's rook now penetrates dangerously. Seizing the open file, white aims to exploit black's temporarily exposed king position. Aggressively seizing the open files, black consolidates defensively amidst the growing pressure. Exchanging the rook simplifies the position, potentially opening lines for white's centralized king. Opening the queenside file for the rook, this recapture simultaneously defends the bishop and prepares counterplay on the b-file. Seizing the open d-file could be white's next step, as the queen now has excellent reach. Focusing on the now open d-file, the king seeks sanctuary behind its pawns. Securing the queenside with queen repositioning aims to exploit the isolated e-pawn and open files. Consolidating material and preparing to contest the open d-file is the immediate priority now. Securing the long diagonal, the rook prepares to dominate the third rank and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure. A proactive pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and gain breathing room for the kingside. Unleashing the rook to the 8th rank seizes control of a vital open file, promising immediate pressure on the black king. Unlocking the queen's diagonal penetration now seems paramount as the king is exposed. Unpinning the rook on a8 opens up diagonal pressure against black's vulnerable king. Seeking an avenue of counterplay, black redirects their queen to a more active diagonal. Seeking to cramp black's queenside, this pressure along the 6th rank aims to stifle any counterplay. Consolidating the bishop to a more secure square allows for potential pawn advances later. Unlocking the queenside endgame by trading queens now seems inevitable and advantageous. The rook's capture finally simplifies the position, entering a pawn-down endgame where white must prove compensation for the material deficit. Activating the king opens lines and eyes for potential discovered threats as the queens depart. Shifting the king towards the center secures it and prepares to contest the open files. Activating the king is paramount, seeking active squares and potential pawn advancement. Seeking active counterplay on the king side, this pawn advances, aiming to create weaknesses and open lines. Activating the king for the endgame is paramount. Exploring the vacant squares, black's king ventures out, seeking active participation in the unfolding endgame. Bolstering the central pawn chain with a piece allows for more robust structural integrity. Shifting the king now opens up crucial defensive diagonals for the remaining pieces. Gaining control of the 7th rank and threatening to infiltrate black's weakened queenside. Preparing to contest the open file and solidify the bishop's defensive post. Activating the bishop to support the pawn's advance and eye the enemy king's safety. Unleashing a pawn storm, this pawn's advance aims to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create a passed pawn down the h-file. Activating the king offers a dynamic counterplay to black's extended pawn structure. Exploring open lines on the king side creates tactical possibilities and may force concessions. Opening the kingside pawn structure for counterplay, sacrificing immediate pawn integrity for dynamic activity. Opening up a new avenue for the bishop, this pawn advance creates dynamic imbalances. Repositioning the monarch aims to prepare for the inevitable pawn push and offers a safer haven. The bishop retreats to a more passive square, potentially surrendering initiative on the central files. Shifting the king to a more active square, preparing for potential pawn pushes and piece redeployments. The bishop retreats, seeking a safer post as the pawn structure on the king side becomes compromised. Repositioning the king to safety is paramount with the opponent's passed pawn looming. Consolidating the rook allows for better defense of the d-file and prepares for potential advances. Repositioning the king to a more active central post to participate in the endgame. The rook vacates the 3rd rank, preparing to support a potential pawn push or redeploy to a more active file. Repetitive king maneuvering stalls progress, delaying a decisive plan in this drawn-out endgame. Repositioning the bishop to d8 signals a desire to defend the weakened kingside pawn structure or prepare a regrouping for the endgame. Bishops are maneuvering for superior squares, anticipating a potential pawn race. Opening the f-file now risks creating permanent weaknesses around the king, but it's a desperate bid for counterplay. Securing the king's safety against potential checks becomes paramount as the game transitions towards an endgame. Embracing the pawn break, black opens critical lines for active counterplay against white's pinned king. Unlocking a dangerous pawn chain opens lines for your king's escape. Stabilizing the rook on the 7th rank now offers pressure against white's weakened queenside. This repositioning aims to secure the rook on the 8th rank, a crucial stronghold as the game simplifies toward an endgame. The bishop now eyes the critical h4 square, potentially reinforcing the pawn chain or preparing for a surprising kingside advance. Unleashing the rook to force the black king into a dangerous outpost. Pursuing the king actively is key, though watch for potential counterplay down the open files. Pushing the pawn forces the knight to retreat, simplifying the position and solidifying white's pawn structure. Unlocking the h-file by moving the bishop offers potential counterplay on the queen side. Unleashing a swift rook, white aims to exploit black's exposed king and potentially fork the monarch and bishop with the subsequent king approach. Seeking to defend against the imminent threats to the monarch, black attempts to consolidate his pieces for a potential counterattack. Driving the enemy king into a mating net with this timely pawn advance creates immediate threats. Seeking refuge on the king's flank after a desperate pawn sacrifice. Retreating the rook to the first rank prepares a potential kingside assault or defends against further pawn thrusts. The bishop retreats, seeking a safer haven on the kingside as the rook prowls aggressively. Securing the crucial 7th rank, this rook repositions aggressively to dominate open files and pressure black's weakened pawn structure. Shifting the rook to the open file offers limited counterplay, as white's pawn structure remains dominant. Pushing the pawn opens a path to potentially gain space and disrupt the opponent's defensive setup. Opening the c-file creates a dynamic contest for central control. Reclaiming the pawn on e6 simplifies to a winning material advantage. Reclaiming the b-file opens up possibilities for the rook to participate actively in the decisive phase of the game. Unlocking the bishop's power on the long diagonal is key to pressuring black's weakened pawn structure. Opening the door for the rook to re-enter the fray on the d-file is a bold gambit. Unleashing a potent discovered attack, the rook sweeps across the board to force the king into a precarious position. Chasing the king to a precarious square, this maneuver prepares a devastating discovered attack. The rook maneuvers to a commanding square, preparing to infiltrate black's weakened kingside and exploit the exposed pawns. Reclaiming the bishop's active diagonal after the rook's repositioning is a clever attempt to reanimate the queenside. Seizing the open file offers a decisive attack against the black king. King's exposed position necessitates careful king activity, but this square is too passive. Slamming the door shut on black's pawn structure, this advance aims to solidify white's central control and restrict enemy piece mobility. The bishop's retreat to c3 wisely prepares for potential pawn pushes on the queenside, reinforcing black's defensive structure. Unleashing the passed pawn to challenge the black king's defense. The rook now surrenders the vital central file, creating a passive defensive setup and inviting further pressure on the king. Seizing the open file to pressure the 7th rank, preparing to trap the misplaced bishop. Opening the king's diagonals creates an escape route, a crucial defensive maneuver against the looming threats. Sacrificing the rook opens a decisive path to the black king, capitalizing on the passed pawn's unstoppable march. The king's final stand collapses as it's forced into a desperate retreat, surrendering all hope of defense. Rescuing the king from the corner allows for potential queenside pawn advancement.